other business we're doing as well. So you've done all those things, and now you get down to the nitty-gritty of the contract. This bit is all about the lawyers. So should you have a peering contract or not when you peer with somebody? And in general, I would say don't. Why not? So firstly is convention. And Bill earlier gave the figure that 99.51% of all peering arrangements are done just on an email exchange, or handshake, or guys just saying, yeah, let's peer. Why make it complicated? It's a well-established concept. It's a well-established, there's a well-established set of principles and best practice around it. You don't need tons of paperwork and lawyers and signatures and stamps and all this kind of stuff. Just keep it simple. Lawyers, once they get involved, they feel compelled, I think, to try and change agreements and to meddle with the wording. And I'm sure lawyers get paid by the word. For every word they change or underline and say, no, that's not acceptable, we have to change that to say this. It's I apologize if there are any lawyers in the room, but in most cases it's not necessary to get into this level of detail for what is a well-established technical concept that has very limited risk on both sides. And the final point on here, if you're going to peer with lots of people, doing contracts does not scale to a large number of peers. And Google, we peer in 65 different internet exchanges, some of which have hundreds of members. I don't know how many peers we have, but it's thousands, I think. And we would not be able to peer with that number of networks if we had a contract with every single one. I would have to have a team of lawyers just doing paperwork to handle all those peering agreements. So even for a big network like us, we do most of our peering without any agreements. But sometimes you do want to have a peering agreement. Why would you have a peering agreement? Well, clarity as to what you're actually doing, who you're doing it with, agreements on the best practice you're going to follow, the fact that peering is best effort and you're not getting a guarantee of service, stuff limiting liability, and sometimes confidentiality if you don't want to disclose that you're peering with a particular network. But if you're going to do it, then always use a template. Always have a template peering agreement ready. Don't get your lawyers to write a fresh one for every single peering contract. And there's you can download peering templates off the internet. There's quite a good one that's a little bit out of date now, but it's still relevant. There's one from Links which you can download. That's the model peering agreement, and everyone copies everyone else peering agreements. There was probably only one lawyer back in the midst of time that wrote the first peering agreement, and everyone has kind of copied off each other since with little tweaks here and there. So there's probably different peering agreements have slightly different terms in them. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. But generally, they cover more or less the same things. And even if you're not going to have an agreement, do stick to best practice in terms of peering. So use MD5 authentication on your session. Make sure you have good root aggregation policies and enforce those on your peers as well. Make sure you set up IPv6 as well as IPv4 peering at the same time. There's a couple of extra lines of BGP config, and once you've done it, you don't have to go back to the peer again in the future. Because of course you all run IPv6 on your networks alongside IPv4, don't we? And then also make sure you exchange contact details with the other ISP so that you issue in the future, you can get in touch with them. Or if you put your contact details in PeeringDB, they're always there for people to find. So what should be in the agreement? Who's actually doing the peering? So the parties involved. And sometimes this isn't always clear. You think you're talking to one particular network, and then you get to the point of setting up peering. It's actually, oh, you're not that network with all that traffic. You're that other network that's very similar, that's kind of maybe sat behind them or something, and you're not actually the guy I wanted to peer with, you're somebody else. So having clarity on the parties involved and what networks, what AS numbers you're going to peer is very helpful. The paperwork should cover multiple interconnections, public and private. So you do the paperwork once, and then you never have to do it again, and you can set up as many peering sessions in as many places as you want without having to go back to the lawyers. This stuff is a little bit painful, but if you do it once, that's fine, and then you can decide, just by agreement with the other party, again, going back to email or talking with them in meetings as to what you're going to do and where you're going to do it. So, and then agreement on any cost sharing. So if you're coming to a particular point to peer with them, you may have an agreement with them as to how, if there's any sharing of the cost of the capacity to reach that place. Might be half circuits, might be, they give you some free colo in the other facility. There's various ways of doing it. Most peering agreements have no provision for cost sharing at all. Each party carries their own costs of coming to the agreed point where you're going to peer. The term of the agreement and how you're going to terminate the agreement if for whatever reason you decide you're not going to peer anymore. Most peering agreements, 1 or 2 years, have a 30-day termination clause, something like that. That's generally sufficient for most. If you want a bit more security and a bit more certainty that your traffic's going to appear in a certain place, you may want to extend the termination period and extend the terms of the peering to a bit longer. But the more restrictive you make the agreement, the less likely you make it that the other guy's going to accept it. So you have to trade these things off. Disclaimers, warranties, liabilities, all the legal stuff. If your equipment blows up, we're not going to pay for new equipment. If someone on our network happens to DDoS you, then you can't sue us for this, all this kind of stuff. Confidentiality clauses. Some people don't want to reveal that they're peering with a particular network. They don't want a press release going out saying, well, I've just set up peering with MTN or Airtel or whatever. So sometimes this clause will be in there. And then there's some legal stuff about assignment of the agreement, which is if the company gets sold, can the peering agreement be transferred? Sometimes you have to ask for permission. Depends what you agree in the agreement. And if there's any regulatory issues around peering, like you both must have telecoms and telco licenses or ISP licenses, you may want to put that in the agreement as well. And the last thing is governing law. And this is another slide from Bill and PCH. And Bill explained this very well yesterday, so I won't go too much into it in terms of what law governs a peering agreement. And if you're peering with local entities, you can probably do it under local law. So, for example, if you're in Tanzanian ISP, peering with another Tanzanian ISP, doing it under Tanzanian law probably makes a lot of sense. But if you're going to start peering with international, like European or US networks, then they're probably not going to accept Tanzanian law or Kenyan law, simply because they don't have the experience of the legal jurisdiction to be able to validate whether it's a good jurisdiction to have a peering agreement in. So if you want to peer with these guys, you may have to accept US law or UK law or Canadian law, for example. So a bit of flexibility there helps a lot. So just as a kind of a recap on all the legal stuff, and just before we finish, 99.51% of all peering agreements have no contracts. And that's probably the best way to do peering in 99.51% of cases. So to conclude, you have to decide who you're going to peer with, where and how, do the cost-benefit analysis of doing that, and get any approvals you need from the guys who hold the budget, if necessary. And the peering negotiations, if they're difficult peers, are not always easy in terms of getting them to agree to peer, in terms of finding mutual locations to peer, and in terms of sharing the costs of that peering. Then when you come to the actual agreement to peer, in general, don't have a peering agreement. Just agree it over email or in a meeting exactly what you're going to do. But if there's money involved, then it gets more complicated, and there's certainly going to be people in your organisation that will want to see a piece of paper if you're expending a significant amount of money to reach a particular location, or if there's cost sharing involved and so on. If you do have a peering agreement, make sure it's clear, make sure it covers what's needed, and it's simple to execute. Don't have pages and pages and pages if possible. I think the Lynx model peering agreement is, depending on how big the font is when you print it out, it's about 2 or 3 pages, and most of that is legal boilerplate rather than anything in particular. And And if you don't have a peering agreement, make sure you do follow best practice in peering anyway. So yeah, if it's a peering contract from a tier 1 or from some difficult network, it's probably not one you want to use.